If you haven't heard about Anchor, it's the easiest way to make a podcast. Let me explain. It's free. There's creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you, so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many more. You can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make a podcast in one place. And it's fun. So download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started today. You'll be glad you did. Thanks. Now back to the fun stuff. Welcome back, fright fiends. Are you afraid of the dark? After this journey, you just might be. Note, the story is for adults and contains cursing and terror. Hello once again to Tom's Atypical Tales of Terror and other stuff. A quick reminder before we begin. Please rate us on Apple or your podcast site of choice, and please like or follow us. It all helps us to get higher up the charts and to grow us. And subscribe to our Patreon for great benefits. And don't forget SpidaGames.com. That's SPIEDA Games.com. Use code ATYPICALHORROR, one word, at checkout to receive 20% off your order, or click the link in the show notes to have it automatically applied. Limited time only. There you will find movies, board games, video games, and collectibles at great prices. If you don't see something you want, feel free to reach out via the customer service links and ask, and we will be happy to order it for you, or may already have it in stock but not uploaded. There are sales ongoing for our grand opening. Spida Games is LGBTQIA friendly, as well as being gay-owned, so help support a small business that supports marginalized folks. And if you came here from the link on Spida, welcome. Thanks for checking out the store and then coming on over here. Now, a quick recap of what this show is all about for new and returning viewers. On this show, I want to tell original horror stories, but I also want to provide a place to talk about the struggles of living and being creative while dealing with the ADHD and autism. In other words, an atypical brain. Each episode will have a small segment on that up front, but the story will always be the main part. Alrighty, with that stuff out of the way, let's get to it. Today I'm going to talk about how I engage with reading, specifically fiction, how that is different from me. I often get very hyper-focused, which means that I focus on one thing to the exclusion of all else. When I hyper-focus, it feels like I am in a trance, like everything else but what I'm focusing on just kind of fades out. Like zooming a camera far in on something and letting everything else in the frame blur. This creates a clarity towards the object that allows for an almost melding with it, where, with stories, I feel like I am taking the journey, or what have you, alongside the characters, not just watching from a distance. This happens with reading much more than watching, because in reading I am not looking outward, I am looking inward towards an open book or screen right in front of me, which blocks everything beyond, so it's just me and the black letters on white, or the panels in case of a comic. Then, when the images form in my head, they become my focus, with the actual physical pages and text being absorbed almost on autopilot, kind of in the background of what they are creating, and everything else beyond that just not there, until something jars me out of it, and then I will notice what's around me again. Realize how much time has passed. This happens when I write fiction, too. I see the words forming on the blank page I write on a typewriter, but also see the images those words are telling just as clearly. It's almost like I am transcribing what I'm seeing. On the other hand, my wife, who does not have autism, gets absorbed but does not feel like she was in a trance. She notices sounds around her, frequently looks up, shifts, gets interrupted. I also like to read certain things out loud, like the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, which I read in a bad British accent so as to better hear the words and language he used, both his fictional languages and the archaic styles of English, but also because I feel he wrote it to be read aloud like an ancient epic. Another example, fittingly, is the Iliad. I'm currently reading it, and I like to do so out loud and to hear it as it would have been heard around fires in Bronze Age Greece. I don't mean in the original Greek, just that it was originally an oral tale and I feel it works best that way. The epicness and flow come out much better, and I've become much more invested and absorbed in it since switching to out loud. Arrival. Danny Rodriguez and Mike Powell left their car over a mile away in the back of a Walmart parking lot and snuck around behind the building. From there, the would-be ghost hunters slipped into the band of dense woods separating the store and their destination. They gaped as they left the woods and saw it, looming above them on the other side of a rusting, ivy-choked chain-link fence, was a vast complex of gray stone buildings, like a medieval castle transported to the heart of a modern American city. Only this fortress was built for keeping people in, not out. Jesus, Danny whispered in stunned appreciation. Burnham State Hospital, formerly St. Martin's Lunatic Asylum. The central building, here Mike indicated the imposing, multi-spired structure from which several wings branched out, was built by the Jesuits in 1870. 5 wings were added over the years, with D-Wing being the last completed in 1933, all made from granite quarried upriver. Danny smirked. Good job on hitting up Wikipedia, Mike. Mike feigned indignation. Hey now, I'll have you know I went to the library and read real books. Several of them. Danny felt nervous just looking at it. The scale, the immensity, was overwhelming. One of the huge double doors fronting the main entrance hung open, leaning on one twisted hinge. It exposed only a black void, inviting them. Come in, see what you find. The sun westered behind them as afternoon turned to evening, and the few intact windows reflecting its light with red eyes glaring down on them. Danny shivered. Feels haunted from here. Mike smiled. Not surprised. Thousands lived here between 1870 and 2000. Hundreds, at least, never left. Danny ran a hand through his short, spiky hair and grimaced. I might have ended up in a place like this. Thank God society's changed. A little, anyways. Me too, Mike said. Back then they thought autistic people were permanently impaired. If I wasn't so high-functioning, able to pass at a glance as normal, neurotypical, I'd have been thrown in there and forgotten, left to rot. Not that I'd want to be in one of those places even now. Some of them are still pretty shitty from what I read. Danny shook his head. Just a couple of freaks, huh? Mike grinned down at him. Yeah. Danny put on an exaggerated face of wonderment. Tell me, Mike, just why the hell are we doing this again? This is the kind of thing stupid teenagers do, sneak into abandoned buildings looking for ghosts. We're stupid mid-20-somethings. We should be drinking too much and not saving enough. Jokes were Danny's coping mechanism against any kind of fear or anxiety, of which he'd known plenty throughout his relatively short life. Already a pit of anxiety was growing in his stomach. Mike laughed. Because, Danny bucko, neither of us ever had the chance to be stupid teenagers. What with you busy all the time still pretending to be someone else, and me, the awkward, quiet geek with no social life. Let's just say we're making up for lost time, trying to fit in as much stupidity as we can before we get too old. And since they're blowing this place down in a month, there's no time to waste. You're never too old to be stupid. Come on, let's go. Danny stepped to the fence. Climbing was out of the question, concertina wire still rigging the top, except where guard towers loomed at each corner and several spots in between. He used the wire cutters he'd brought to cut an opening, then left them to be retrieved later when they were done. They squeezed through the gap and crossed the football field length of waist-high grass between the fence and the main entrance. On the way, Mike turned to Danny. Got your mask? Yep. They put on the N95 masks they'd bought at Home Depot. There had to be asbestos in there. Then they were at the bottom of the stairs. Mike started up, but Danny just stood, staring into the darkness beckoning from the opening at the top, now seeming to gape like a huge mouth. Sweat broke out on his arms. Danny? Mike asked from halfway up. You okay? We don't have to do this. No, it's fine, Danny said, and with reluctance, he followed Mike up the steps and inside. Once Danny's eyes adjusted to the room, dark compared to the deepening twilight outside, he was stunned. He stood in a cavernous space, ceiling lost in darkness high above. In the center of a vast lobby, an ornate staircase led up to the administrative offices on the floors above. Huge openings led to the wings, one on each side wall and 3 along the back. Flashlight beams stabbed around the dimming room moments later as he and Mike switched them on. Clack! Did you hear that? Danny asked, swinging his light around to look behind him, where he thought it had come from. Hear what? Mike asked. Nothing, I guess. Let's check out our phones before we head in there. They pulled out their phones and saw that they had nearly full batteries. Good. Alright, where do we head first? Danny asked, putting his phone away and scanning the enormous room. He thought back to the conversation they'd had in the van on the way over. Well, Mike had said, stories on the internet talk about the ghosts of kids in D-Wing and a nurse in an A-Wing, among others. Other various stories like that throughout the wards and offices. Should be pretty fun. And then there's the tunnels, Danny had added. Tunnels? Supposedly this entire place has tunnels running underneath it. originally for maintenance, but according to the stories, the doctor set up a lab down there where he could do things beyond the pale, even for standards of the 40s or 50s. Human experimentation, vivisections, Nazi shit like that. Supposedly, Mike had asked, have they not been found? A few claim so online, but then say that they couldn't find them again. Apparently, all the entrances were made as secret panels, blending in with the walls so that patients wouldn't be able to hide down there. Mike shook his head. That sounds like the setup for a horror movie. I'll believe... Memory Mike was cut off by actual Mike. Maybe just go alphabetical? Start with A-Wing and go from there? Danny nodded. Sounds good to me. Explorations. The reinforced double doors separating the central building from the secure A-Wing hung ajar. Nothing was visible through the small gap, nor through the small mesh reinforced window in each door. Mike put a hand on one to open it, then stopped. You believe any of that? Ghosts and whatnot? Think we'll actually see anything? I don't know. It'd certainly be awesome if we did. Why? You afraid, Mikey? Danny said this last the way an older sibling might taunt a younger. Here, I'll go first. He stepped forward, grabbed the door out of Mike's hand, and pushed it open. It squealed on rusty hinges. Danny strode through, not waiting for Mike to follow. As he passed, he could see the amused smirk on Mike's face. The heebie-jeebies of earlier had definitely passed. You grew quite a pair, didn't you? Bet your ass I did. Mike could get away with things others would be too nervous to say, like jokes about Danny's masculinity, since they both coped with humor and had been close for a long time. Mike, too, knew what it was like to be different, to look different on the outside than one felt on the inside. As a high-functioning autistic person, he was often judged as lazy or incompetent or weird based on the standards of neurotypical society, because people didn't see that he struggled to understand and often missed the subtle social cues they gave him. They met in class freshman year and became fast friends after Mike asked a mostly closeted Danny out. Danny said that he didn't realize Mike identified as a woman, laughed, and politely informed him of his sexual orientation. That was when Mike had told Danny about his autism. It explained a lot of the little differences that Danny had noticed. A flatter affect to his face and voice, a tendency to downplay emotional expressions, a tendency to misunderstand things unless he was very literal. It didn't take long after this for Danny to make the hard decision to risk telling everyone else the truth about himself, that he was a trans man who liked women and who was planning to start his transition soon. To his happy shock, Mike listened, smiled, and said, "Should I start singing that song from Mulan?" From that moment on, they chatted continually about what it meant to Danny to transition, and what being a man meant in general, something neither were experts about, given their shared status outside the social norm. Mike went with Danny to get his first testosterone shot later that year to offer support, since Danny had little from his traditional-minded family. Then, once Danny said he was ready, Mike took him out shopping for a new wardrobe. Though he was no expert on what was cool, he'd at least worn male clothing his entire life. One day they went to a fancy department store in the mall, more to get ideas than to buy, and when they reached the suit section, Danny had just gone straight to the center and then spun in circles, looking at all the suits with what Mike later said were the hungriest eyes I'd ever seen. Now I can wear a suit whenever I want, and nobody will look at me strange. Mike gave him a quizzical look at that statement. I wasn't allowed to wear a suit to prom or graduation, and I haven't had a reason to since. Want to know what I did to get back at them for prom? Mike nodded. Well, I decided if I couldn't be dapper, I'd be obnoxious, so I wore the biggest, fluffiest white dress I could find. Danny chuckled at the memory. My date wasn't too happy about how much it dwarfed hers, or that I wore a tiara. Mike laughed, then paused. Danny expected a witty retort, but instead Mike put a hand on his shoulder, looked at him with emotion clear on his face, and said, with a smile, Guess you'll have to be my best man if I ever get married then. I'll make sure your suit is fire. Standing next to Mike at his wedding 2 years after college in an exquisitely tailored suit with the perfect bow tie and pocket square, and a mirror-shine wingtips had been one of the highlights of Danny's life. Mike and Danny always had a similar level of respect for each other's struggles, which had grown over the years into a trust that would carry them through anything. A-Wing had one long hallway, lined with padded cells. Other rooms included nurses' stations, exam rooms, and janitors' closets. Not being experienced ghost hunters, Danny and Mike mostly just walked along, looking around and asking if anyone was there. Outside a random cell, Mike stopped. Is this where they stuck the autistic people to rot? This or some other place like it? A tiny hole with nobody else? He looked at the empty space around him. Poor people, they didn't deserve this. I'm glad things changed, but they didn't change fast enough. Never do. Let's keep going. They moved on. They both thought they saw shadow figures darting about at different times, but it was hard to be sure. They were gone so fast and could just have been from the flashlights moving about. Quiet so far. Boring even, Mike said when they were about 2/3 of the way down. About what I expected. Danny didn't believe in ghosts or expect to find anything. They had dismissed their earlier jitters as nerves about A, trespassing, and B, going into a dangerously dilapidated building. Still, it was a bit disappointing. Not living up to its reputation so far, Mike chuckled. Nope, not yet. They were nearing the end. It was not straight, every 50 feet or so kinking left or right, just enough to create subsections bound by blind corners. To make it easier to box in escapees and to not give them a nice straight lane to run down, Danny figured. Every 100 yards or so, they came to a set of security doors further compartmentalizing the wing, which was about 500 yards long. The kinks and doors combined to render the corridor a disorienting maze where it became all too easy to lose track of how far you'd gone or where exactly in it you were. It made Danny anxious in a subliminal way, like a faint sense of unease permeated him. Rounding another corner, Danny shined his light around, checking nameplates, those that remained, to see what rooms were in this subsection, aside from cells. One plate caught his attention. Danny went closer to get a good look. It read, Gender Therapy. Fury swept him. Mike came up next to Danny and saw the look on his face. We can skip this one. Let's just go on. Danny's face twisted into a furious snarl. Fuck this place. Sudden inspiration struck Danny. He always kept a Sharpie in his pocket for doodling. He pulled it out and scrawled, Born this way, across the nameplate, obscuring the terrible words. Ready to move on? Mike asked with a half smile and raised eyebrow. Yeah. In another few minutes, they reached the dead end of the corridor. Well, doesn't seem anybody wants to play tonight, Mike said dejectedly. Too bad. Want to head upstairs? I think I saw the door to the stairwell a couple sections back. Sure, Danny said. I was really hoping for more, too. But there's still a lot of ground to cover. Maybe things will get a bit more exciting later. I hope so. They turned to head back up the corridor, Mike in the lead. As they neared the first turn, Danny saw movement in one of the rooms. Hold on. He darted into the room and shined his light around. Nothing. Must have imagined it. Danny turned back to the hall just in time to see a large man shape disappearing around the corner into the shadows ahead. Mike must not have heard him before. Wait, he said, hurrying to catch up. Rounding the corner himself, he saw no one. Mike? Here. The voice came from an open door he hadn't seen before on the right. The stairs? The opening was pitch dark and he went closer and shined his flashlight into it. There were stairs, but they went down? Chills coursed through him. The tunnels were real. How did we not see this before? Mike? You down there? Come down. It's cool. It sounded like Mike, but not quite. It was off, flat. Danny didn't like it. Danny wasn't sure what to do. Shouldn't leave Mike alone down there, if that is Mike. He shined his light up and down the corridor. It was empty. Must be him. Maybe he sounds weird because of echo or something? Okay, I'm coming. Danny forced himself to step into the black opening and down the steps, though every fiber of his being said to run. At the bottom, he shined the light around and saw nothing. Nobody. Just another empty corridor. Then the hair on the back of his neck stood up. It felt as if somebody was behind him. Danny turned and saw a figure at the top of the stairs, silhouetted in the minimal light that found its way into the corridor above. In the dark. Mike, he started, but no, it wasn't Mike. The figure wore a policeman-style cap and light shined off leather boots. Mike had never been down here. Danny knew that now. More of what Mike had said on the way over about the tunnels and who was supposed to haunt them crashed into Danny's mind. The guard, no names given, is described as a man in a 1950s-style guard's uniform. He's supposedly the apparition of the guard who brought the doctor his victims. Now he stalks the tunnels looking for his next one. Fear jolted Danny and dried his mouth. Coño, it can't be. Teeth glinted wide as a guttural chuckle emerged from its throat. Then the door slammed shut and it was lost in the darkness. Moments later, Danny heard boots coming down the stairs. Clack, clack, each step echoing for long moments before the next. Clack, clack. With each slow, deliberate step, fear built in Danny, edging ever closer to outright panic. Danny took a deep breath, fought for control. If he panicked and ran, he might never find a way out. Can it hurt me? He didn't want to find out. What do I do? Charge through it to the door? Would that hurt me? What if it's solid? What if the door is locked? It didn't seem to matter anyways. Danny was frozen, paralyzed by dread as those boots came ever closer. What broke him was the change in tone from metallic to dull stony as it stepped onto the concrete floor. Danny whipped the light up from where it, and the arm holding it, dangled at his hip, hoping the thing would disappear in its brightness. There, not 2 feet from him, it stood, solid as any living man he'd ever seen in life. It towered over him, must have been at least 6.5 feet tall, taller even than Mike. Its navy uniform, brown leather boots, and Sam Brown belt were all immaculate. No wrinkles, nothing out of place. Breath stuck in Danny's throat, and the light began to jitter as his hand shook. Danny forced himself to crane his head up and see its face. Its skin was the pale gray of a corpse, eyes black holes. For a moment Danny thought he might be ensnared, trapped in their inky blackness. Then it tilted its head, bared its teeth, and lunged at his throat with outstretched hands. Danny turned and ran down the corridor, heedless and careless, desperate to escape the thing. It was almost like it had forced him to lose control, to go where it wanted, into the labyrinth. As he ran, more of Mike's words ran through his mind. If he sees you, he'll follow, never hurrying, always steadily, implacably there, just waiting for you to panic and fall. No one knows what would happen if he caught you, but the theory is that he will take you, or your soul, to the doctor so he can continue his mad experiments. But no one really knows. Then all coherent thought left Danny, replaced by an animal survival instinct driven by panic. He ran until cramps racked his diaphragm, but pushed through them in a panic-driven fog, until he stepped on a piece of concrete, crumbled from the ceiling through long-ago water infiltration, and fell. For a moment he lay where he was and listened, water dripping from numerous leaks worn through the crumbling ceilings, squeaks and skitters. Danny, heart racing, rose to one knee, then to his feet, which were now wet and cold from running through numerous puddles. But for the rats, he was alone. He let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding and wondered what to do next. Am I safe? Is it gone? Where am I? How will I get out? Can I get out? He had to try. Somehow, Danny knew there was no going back, only forward, in the hopes of finding another exit. At first, he had the flashlight, revealing a mold-covered, debris-strewn warren of wet tunnels, red rust visible everywhere from overhead pipes, down walls and on the floors. These were lined with cells. The cells had no padding, no beds, no toilets, just bare concrete floors and walls, on many of which scratches were visible. Fingernail scratches, many streaked with the red of old, dried blood. Stains covered the floors, from waste left by those poor trapped souls who had had no other choice. Screams echoed randomly down the halls, always from different directions. The sounds of people enduring the worst tortures imaginable, of people suffering in the dark. From many cells Danny heard moans, sobs, the broken laughter of the insane. Nerves frayed and Danny became jumpy, throwing his light towards every new sound, waiting for the next scream to erupt, never knowing when or from where it would come. Every drop of water hitting his head or shoulder jolted him closer to panic. He felt utter sorrow and despair for these souls, for what had happened to them, for the fact that death had brought no reprieve, but could do nothing for them. Could only keep moving, keep searching for a way out. Guess it really is haunted, Danny thought with black humor. He kept moving, kept looking for a way out, determined not to die down here. He went down many dead ends, and no matter which direction he turned, always seemed to be going deeper into the maze. After at least an hour seemed to have passed, maybe more, the flashlight began to flicker, and before long was dead. Danny pulled his phone from his pocket and swiped it on. 9:20. 3 hours since he'd entered the building, and maybe 1.5 since he'd stupidly come down here. 86% battery. Enough to last several hours at least with just the flashlight on. There was no signal down here, of course, so it couldn't be used for anything else anyways. In a half hour, the low battery tone chirped. 40 minutes, and it was dead. What modern phone goes from 86% to dead in 40 minutes? It must be him. Aren't ghosts supposed to be able to drain batteries? Que mierda. His head flew up from the dead phone. Footsteps. Hard boots clacking off the cement floor, drawing nearer and nearer. Oh God. Danny couldn't look behind him, knowing what he'd see if he did. Waves of fear coursed through his body. He couldn't stay here. He made his way up the corridor away from the thing, moving as fast as he could without losing control and running again. Time stopped and there was only darkness and movement. Danny kept a hand on the wall, which alternated between slime and grime, and shuffled his feet to avoid stepping on anything that could trip him again. He made steady progress, yet it drew ever closer. Clack. 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 Danny closed his useless eyes and fought to control his breathing, fought to keep the panic at bay. Soon it was close enough to hear breathing behind him, heavy and ragged. Danny could even smell the faint yet pungent odor of cologne, like the kind of stuff his dad wore when he was a kid. He almost wanted to believe a real, living person was stalking him. Almost. Then Danny felt fingertips brush his hair, and it was like he had been tasered. He jumped, broke out in gooseflesh, and yelped. Panicked, he ran again, but forced a hand on the wall, which disappeared into empty space after a few moments. A doorway! He turned and darted in, hoping there was still a door to close. Relief flooded Danny when he found one still on its hinges and slammed it shut. He felt for a lock and found none, not even a handle. Must be a patient cell. It started to press inward against him. No, 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 no! He pushed back against the door, planted his feet, and shoved. It clanged back into the frame and held. Danny gritted his teeth and held on. The door bulged inwards against him, but did not open. A test of strength and willpower, then. In the dark, time had no meaning. Danny had no idea how long he stood there, pushing back against it, thoughts racing manically. Go the fuck away, go the fuck away, go the fuck away. Oh God, I'm going to die, I'm going to die. No, not now, not here. Go the fuck away, go the fuck away, go the fuck away. At some point, his thighs began burning. Oh shit, fuck, shit. Danny started to worry he wouldn't hold much longer. Then the pressure let up a bit, as if it was regathering itself. Danny held on to let himself breathe a little easier. Should never have let Mike talk me into this shit. Relive the crazy high school experiences we never got to the first time. What could go wrong? A wide asshole. It slammed into the door harder than ever, and his Doc Martens began to slide on the smooth concrete floor. A fraction of an inch. A little more. The door began cracking open. Despite knowing it was pointless, Danny began screaming for help. Danny pushed back against the door as hard as he could, but it was no good. It kept opening, inch by inch. Danny was ready to give in and accept his fate when, without warning, it stopped. The door slammed shut under the weight he was putting on it, and Danny's feet slid out from under him. He slammed into it, then slid to the floor. Is it toying with me? What does it want with me? To trap me down here forever? I think it might have succeeded. Danny didn't like to say its name. The guard. Somehow that made it even more real. He didn't want the stories to be real. What he wanted didn't matter. Either he was crazy, or they were real. He preferred real. Real or not, he wanted to be anywhere but here. Why the hell did I agree to this anyway? Because it would be fun? No, that wasn't it. That wasn't why either of them had come. Not really. Why then? What did we have to prove? That we're real men? Not that either. They didn't give a shit about being real men. Then what? Danny thought he knew. It was about reclaiming our stories, telling the world we won't wait anymore. Now that they had some semblance of happiness, of normalcy in their lives, they would do the things so many others who didn't have to expend all their energies on just trying to survive, and who weren't on the outside looking in, took for granted. Things like doing stupid shit with friends. Like having friends. Smart move that turned out to be. He leaned his head against the door and tried to relax, but then morbid thoughts crept in. A month until this place is destroyed. Danny pictured construction workers finding his body as they cleared debris from the exposed tunnels. Would they be shocked? Or maybe they wouldn't bother clearing debris, just fill the tunnels with concrete and move on, entombing Danny's corpse forever. Would Danny's spirit linger like all the others? And if so, would it be trapped down here, doomed forever in darkness? Or would it haunt the condos above? Danny pictured himself haunting some rich person in their luxury condo and began to laugh. What started as a soft giggle unexpectedly blossomed into a mad, screeching cackle, over which Danny soon lost all control. Danny laughed no longer just at his little scenario, but at this whole insane situation. At the realization that his life was about to end barely lived. He'd only just graduated college a couple years ago and hadn't even found a job in his chosen field, biochemistry. Had been working odd jobs to make ends meet. Hadn't experienced real love either. Romantic love. Of course, his love for Mike as a friend was as real as could be. He clutched his aching torso and rolled onto the floor, laughter intensifying so much he thought his lungs might burst. Without warning, it turned into braying sobs, the kind he hadn't cried since the death of his mother, the kind that seemed to be the manifestation of every ounce of pain within. The sobs began to ebb, and exhaustion overwhelmed Danny. He felt his eyes closing, and, lost and alone in the dark, sleep took him. The last thing Danny was aware of, maybe, as he drifted away, was the door creaking open. Nowhere. Anywhere. Danny's eyes flew open out of a dead sleep. He squinted against a bright light. Where? He was no longer on a cold concrete floor. He was on something padded and not very wide. A gurney? He thought so. As his eyes adjusted to the light, Danny looked around. He was in a room that looked like some kind of lab or operating room. Not a gurney, a surgical table. Danny tried to sit up but found his wrists and ankles strapped to the table. Danny struggled but couldn't loosen them. Now, let's not hurt ourselves. I want you in one piece for my examinations. A figure stepped into view from behind Danny's head. It wore a gray, 1950-style white surgical smock, short-sleeved with a high, closed collar. The doctor. Who else could it be? The last of Mike's car-ride speech ran through his brain. What is known is that, as mad or immoral as he might have been in life, the decades of solitude in the dark have driven him as insane as any of the poor people he tortured. He didn't look anything like what Danny had imagined when Mike had been telling his stories, which seemed like ages ago now. He didn't look like the cliché mad doctor at all. No wild eyes, no manic grin, no dry washing of hands. Instead, he looked like a genial man in his 30s, balding with a fringe of brown hair and bespectacled, with an expression as if he was about to say, "Relax, that appendix will be out soon enough and you won't feel a thing," or something innocuous like that. That somehow made it worse. He stepped next to Danny and looked him up and down, as if inspecting a side of meat, deciding what cuts to make. As with the guard, no eyes were visible behind his spectacles, only black holes. "You're one of those deluded freaks who get surgery to change their gender, aren't you? Usually I try to cure such afflicted individuals before they reach that stage of delusion." Danny grimaced. "I wasn't born a man, but I'm more a man than you'll ever be. Va pa carajo, hijo de puta!" The doctor smirked, and, if he had eyes, Danny was sure he'd be rolling them. "But since the time for prevention is past, we'll have to try reconstruction." The doctor laughed and reached for Danny's shirt, slicing it open with a scalpel to reveal Danny's chest. "Well, we'll just have to refill those now, won't we?" He turned to a tray on a stand behind him. "Oh shit, I have to get out of here." Danny struggled against the bonds, but he was secured with buckles, no knots to loosen. He began to feel panic rise as the doctor turned back with a scalpel in one hand and a handful of stuffing in the other. The kind you'd find in a teddy bear. "Let's get you fixed up." He stepped forward and brought the scalpel down to cut Danny open. "No!" Danny screamed and began to rock back and forth in a desperate attempt to overturn the table and somehow free himself. It tilted precipitously first one direction then the other, until crashing into and through the doctor, who snarled in frustration. Upon impact, the room was plunged into darkness and silence. Who knows where? After laying stiff for a moment, Danny realized he could no longer feel any bonds. Was it a dream? Am I still in the same place I passed out? Was any of it real? Before any further thoughts, a sensation broke through. Pain. A searing pain in his left thigh. What? Danny reached down with a shaking hand and touched his leg. His hand landed on something long, thin, and metallic laying on his thigh, sticking out of it. A handle. To what? He had to laugh. Usually it would be a needle full of testosterone. Then an image came back to him. The doctor, scalpel in hand. It must have gotten lodged in his leg when the table tipped. Probing a little further, it became clear that the blade had stuck sideways between the connective tissue and muscle on the top of his thigh. How is this possible? It couldn't be a dream then. But how could a ghost leave a real scalpel in my thigh? In the end, it didn't matter. What mattered was getting out of here, if he could. Can't do that with this hanging from my leg. At least I got lucky. It could be jammed straight in deep, or have hit my femoral. I should be able to remove it without bleeding to death. Danny gently grasped the handle and pulled. Held breath hissed through gritted teeth at the burst of pain that followed. Coño! The blade slid free without trouble, and Danny felt blood begin to flow out onto his leg, wetting his jeans. Not a torrent, but a steady ooze. He had worn an old, ripped t-shirt for this investigation, so it was easy to tear a long strip off and wrap it around his leg. A sock was folded into a pad for the wound. Sweaty, but better than nothing. Danny realized that he didn't feel that unnatural fear anymore. He was afraid, sure. But it was the fear of being trapped alone in the dark, not the overwhelming, all-consuming, amorphous fear he had felt when the guard had been nearby. Danny stilled himself and listened for long minutes. No boots clacking, no sadistic laughter, no creak of leather, no screams from afar, and most of all, a sense of emptiness, of aloneness that he hadn't felt before. Was it really gone? If so, what now? He could sit here and wait for rescue, but this wasn't like being lost in the woods. In the woods, you at least had the possibility of a helicopter flying over and spotting you, or rescuers finding you. You could make fire to signal them. Not so down here. Down here it was different. Down here he was trapped in a pitch-black maze with hidden entrances, a maze no one else believed existed. Down here he was as on his own as one could be. I sit, I die. It really was that simple. At least if he started walking, he had a chance of finding another exit, even if by pure luck. What if it's still out there, just waiting? If so, he'd deal with that when it happened. But Danny didn't think he would run into him again. Also, the longer Danny was awake, the clearer his thoughts became. The less real the events before he had awoken seemed, the hazier and more indistinct. If it wasn't real, then what? Was he going crazy? Once down the stairs, had he breathed in some fume or gas, despite the mask, that had caused him to hallucinate? Or maybe just his own fear had done it. What about the door? The guard slammed it shut. I saw it. Had he? Or had he been holding it and pulled it behind him? Danny thought back. He saw himself at the top of that dark opening. Then walking down, never touching the door. He shut it. I'm sure of it. I think. Damn it, why is everything so fuzzy? A new type of panic began to creep in. A panic at not being able to trust his own thoughts and memories. And not being able to tell what was real and what wasn't. The scalpel! That was proof it was real. He hadn't thrown it when he pulled it out. Only let it fall to the side. Danny began feeling around next to him, covering a much wider area than should be necessary to find it. Other than bits of concrete from the ceiling and slicks of mold. Nothing. Que mierda! The unexpected, shocking cry of frustration bounced and echoed off the hard walls of the empty room, as if the very building was shouting Danny's words back at him in mock parody, as if it was a callous scientist watching a mouse bumble around in a maze for its own amusement. Fuck you, pendejo. I will get out of here. Anger gave Danny the strength to stand and find the door. The last echoes of his voice were fading as Danny's hands touched the smooth metal of the door. In an instant, gut-clenching fear replaced anger in Danny's chest. He didn't want to open it. Summoning all his courage, he did. The creak as it opened was thunderous in the silence, like a sarcophagus lid opening in some ancient, forgotten tomb. Somehow, Danny chuckled. Am I the mummy? The little bit of humor broke the spell of fear, and it was easy to step into the hall. If this was the same room, it had been on his right when he ducked into it. He'd keep it that way and keep heading the same direction. Taking a breath, Danny turned and, hand on the wall, walked through the darkness. Each slow, careful step was excruciating. He wanted nothing more than to run, to get out of here as fast as possible. But that would be suicide. If he did that, he could trip and crack his skull or break an ankle, never mind evil ghosts. One foot in front of the other, that's all. We can do this. Just breathe. His steps, soft as possible, still seemed to make heavy echoing thumps, though Danny knew they must be exaggerated in the dark. After a few minutes more, sounds began to creep in around the edges of awareness. A squeak here, a clatter of falling concrete bits there. Perfectly natural. Yet each time they sounded, Danny jumped, heart racing in his chest, thoughts flying. What was that? Where? Was it him? Oh God, was it him? Then Danny would take a deep breath, tell himself it was nothing, and resume his slow march. Each time it became more difficult to calm himself, to not let panic overwhelm. Then a mouse or a rat ran over Danny's foot, and he could only muster enough control not to run. He couldn't control the long, loud that erupted from his lips or the sobs that followed. Danny didn't know how long he walked like that. Tears, snot running from his nose, gurgling sounds from his hitching chest. But when they faded, that was when the new sounds began, or when he began imagining new sounds, whichever it really was. Always fragmentary, always transitory. A few bars of laughter, a single sob, part of a word. Once, maybe, the far-off echoes of a fading scream. Maybe. From no direction in all directions they came, just there, surrounding and suffusing Danny, tearing at the edges of his tenuous grip on reality, wearing it down bit by bit until it was all he could do to softly chant, "Leave me alone, leave me alone, leave me alone." A small mantra of defiance, a quiet benediction of hope. Danny walked, one foot in front of the other, step by weary, tormented step, turn after turn, hoping each was the one that led to a way out, hope fading a little more each time it wasn't. At some point, after hope had faded to a dim ember and he walked more out of a stubborn refusal to quit than any actual thought he might find an exit, Danny's hand lost its touch on the wall, that guiding line, and he began to weave drunkenly through the blackness, no longer caring what direction he went, or if he got out or ended up in the very center of the maze. At some point, Danny tripped on something and went sprawling. Danny was content to lay there until he died, was done with all this. This wasn't done with him. It was while lying there on the floor of that dirty hallway that Danny heard the one sound he'd never wanted to hear again. Clack. Danny froze, blood draining from face and breath halting as terror gripped him. He listened, hoping that he just imagined it, that it wouldn't repeat. He lay unmoving, waiting, as seconds ticked by, each seeming to last a century. Sweat began running down his face and the stink of fear rose to his nostrils from his soaking body. After what must have been 15 or even 20 seconds, Danny relaxed, released his breath, relief entering him. Must have imagined it. Clack. Oh God. Clack. 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 Slow and deliberate. Once every 3 seconds or so, each closer than the last. The paralysis broke and Danny shot to his feet. Stay awake, Avron! Danny shouted. He managed not to run as before, but to hold it at a fast walk. Is it driving me back to the doctor? Danny hoped not. What else? Where else? As Danny hurried on, the floor became wetter and wetter with each turn. Slick, then shallow puddles, then flooded, maybe an inch deep. It was a wonder he never slipped and fell. Danny rounded a left turn and froze, not in fear, but in shock at what he saw ahead. Light, a thin strip high up in the distance. A cracked door at the top of the stairs. It has to be. It had forced him to run in deeper in the beginning, and now, maybe it was done with him and forcing him out. Or maybe he'd just gotten lucky. Either way, he didn't care. For a moment he was aware of nothing else, except the hope of escape. Then the sound of the boots behind him, hard, dry, clacks, despite the water, broke his trance and Danny ran. He ran through ankle-deep water, cold as ice, and, when his outstretched hands hit and grabbed a railing, it was slick and pitted and Danny knew these stairs, if not rusted away, might be very weak. Danny didn't care, didn't have time to care. It was all but on him now. He bolted up the steps. Better hold. Though they sagged, they did, except for the third, opening under his right foot and swallowing it. But Danny pulled it up and kept going. As Danny reached the landing, he could see that the door was cracked less than an inch. At this point, the boot steps were metallic as it followed him up. Danny did not stop, slamming headlong into the door, hoping to push it wide open. Instead, it moved an inch or so and stopped. No! Danny slammed his shoulder into it, again and again, as it drew closer. Slam! With each step closer, with each blow, the door widened a little more. 3 inches, 6 inches, a foot. Slam! Closer, a foot and a half. Slam! Closer, maybe 3 steps down, 2 feet. Slam! Closer, top of landing, within grabbing distance. The door flew open as whatever was on the other side gave way and Danny followed it out, momentum carrying him into a bright hallway. Danny turned, grabbed the door and flung it shut in the face of the guard. It began slamming into the door as Danny held it shut, in perverse copy of what he had just done. Only this time it was more than just an inert pile of old furniture against the door. This time he could push back, could hold. As he held, Danny became aware that the hallway wasn't bright. It just seemed that way to eyes adjusted to pure darkness. It was just one of the wings, lit by what little light pollution made it through the tiny, dirty windows in the rooms. The same wings that had seemed so dark before. Then the slamming stopped, the door shutting under his weight, Danny sliding to his butt against it. Footsteps came seconds later from up the hall. Did it get out some other way? How could it move so fast? Then Danny was screaming, wild and incoherent. So much had sense and reason departed that Danny failed to see that the owner of the said footsteps were preceded around the bend in the hallway by a stabbing flashlight beam. Arms enveloped Danny and he began fighting to break free. No, you won't take me, you can't have me, he won't cut me. These and more broke through the wordless babble and screams. "Danny! Danny, it's me!" A voice, familiar, said, as the thing holding him blocked his blows. "Calm down. You're okay. It's okay." Danny calmed as the voice broke through. He knew that voice. "Mike?" Danny said, finally seeing the face in front of his for what it really was, seeing the blue shirt in the glow of the flashlight. "Mike!" He wept in exhausted relief. Mike waited until he finished. "Danny, what happened? Where have you been? How did you get from A-Wing all the way to C-Wing without me seeing you?" "I've been searching for hours," Mike said, "including this hallway, several times." Danny told him of the tunnel, the guard, and the doctor. He glossed over many details, wanting to leave this place sooner rather than later. Mike helped him to the center of the hallway, now that Danny's adrenaline was spent. His leg hurt quite badly, then examined the wall where the door was supposed to be. After long minutes poring over every inch of it, pushing, feeling for minute cracks or spaces, hoping to perhaps trip a spring latch and release a hidden door, he found nothing, Mike said. No evidence of a door. Danny saw the look Mike gave him. "So you don't believe me?" "I believe you," Mike said. Danny could see from his face that he told the truth. "I have no idea how you got down there and back out, but I believe you." "Let's get out of here," Danny said. Mike stood and bent to lift Danny. "No." "Yes," Mike cut in. "You'll slow us up too much limping along on that leg without my help." Danny was too exhausted to protest further. Mike wrapped an arm around his shoulder. Danny, much shorter, had to settle for wrapping his around Mike's torso. Dawn. It didn't take long to reach the exit. As they approached it, Danny could see the sky was already deep purple rather than black, and lightening by the moment. Tears of relief prickled his eyes as he left that evil place behind. By the time they reached the fence, the sky beyond the trees was just turning to gray. As he turned to slide through the hole sideways, Danny faced the asylum one last time. Still nestled in shadow and darkness, it was hard to make out, but that opening was visible, a darker shadow within the shadows. Danny shuddered, unable to turn away. "Goodbye. See you soon," he felt it say. "I don't think so," Danny thought, picturing those buildings as nothing but rubble, those tunnels exposed to the bright light of day, then filled in with concrete. Once Mike was through the hole in the fence, Danny turned and saw the asylum, and its ghosts, no more. When his body hit the soft seat as he sat in the car, rays of new-risen sun on his face, Danny at last let exhaustion overtake him and slept. He never went ghost hunting again. That's it for tonight. Be careful in the dark. There just might be something in it. One last thing. I just want to give a quick shout out and thanks to Dan and Lindsay at the Scared to Death podcast. The inspiration from this story came from one of theirs, though it was very much just a general starting point, pursued by ghosts and tunnels under asylum, from which I've traveled quite far. If you like this show, I urge you to check out Scared to Death. I listen every week and it's always spooky fun. Thanks, Dan and Lindsay. Bye, everyone.